All right, let's continue. So we left off talking about kind of the conditions for slaves. And so, how was the slave population diverse? Well, by 1791, by the edge of their revolution, two-thirds of all slaves were African-born. Because of the harsh conditions, they had to constantly bring in new people. 5 to 10% of the population in Haiti would die from diseases like malaria, malnutrition, and that they're just not being fed enough, so they're not giving enough calories to really maintain, and just these horrible work conditions. So with 10% dying off each year, they need constant new labor and the constant importation of new slaves to replace the dead and keep up with this constant demand for more and more sugar. And so as the revolt got closer and closer, they started to bring in more and more slaves, and eventually they really are imbalanced. There is diversity within the slave population, however, and so slaves born on the island are likely to live longer and have a slightly better life, albeit as a slave. In that they already understand the plantation culture, they understand the rules, and so they may have a better connection to the plantation. In most cases, they'll have family. And if you have family on the plantation, you're less likely to revolt, because if you revolt, right, it can affect your entire family. You're less likely to run away, because it's going to be very difficult to run away with your entire family. So if you have connections to the plantation, you're less likely to revolt. But if you're all alone, revolt is the easy conclusion to jump to. In most cases, they'll also, because they're born into it, they're going to practice Catholicism, which is going to be the religion of their masters. And so they're going to fit in slightly better than new Africans that need to be trained, don't have family, and have their own religions. These elite slaves that are born in and understand the culture are going to get better jobs. They're going to be given positions of authority. And so they'll become domestic slaves, kind of house slaves, maids, servants in the house, so they're going to be off the field. They'll be supervisors in the field, so they'll be ruling over other slaves. Or they could be artisans, people that are going to create things like a blacksmith or other types of hard work to make things for people to use. And then when the revolution does occur, these elite slaves, these top-tier slaves, will become the leaders of the revolution, guys like Toussaint Louverture and Dessalines, and were the people that were already born on the island and understand it well enough to revolt against it. And so, who were the affranchis? The affranchis simply means ex-slaves, so these are former slaves, also known as the gens de couleur, libre, free people of color. This population increases until the white population and the affranchis population are eventually equal in number, and so this population just kept getting bigger and bigger, and it's definitely a unique situation for them, and that, well, I'll get more on that. This is mostly the mixed population, or mulatto, mixed children of planters' black mistresses. And so in many cases the planter, or kind of the white owner or white overseer, would have sex with some of the slaves, resulting in mixed children. And in many cases these mixed children would be set free. In other cases they bought their freedom, because in a lot of cases these slaves were allowed to have side gardens that they could tend to, and on certain days of the week they can sell off whatever extra food they have out of these side gardens. And eventually, if they raise enough money through making things through these side gardens, they can buy their own freedom and move on in life. And by 1750, by the time of the revolution, this affranchi population is really starting to get powerful and gain wealth, and they're not really being balanced out by the white population. They're growing at a higher rate. And so in some cases, some former slaves will start plantations with their own slaves. And so they'll gain their freedom, and then they'll start and own their own slaves with their own plantation, because that's really the only way to make money, the only way to get rich in Haiti. So it sounds horrible, and it is horrible, but that's how the system works, is if you want to make money, if you want to have status, you need to own slaves. In other cases, some will serve in the military, the local police force, to control the slave population. Vodou. Vodou, it's the majority religion in Haiti today, similar to Voodoo in New Orleans, Santeria in Cuba, Candomblé in Brazil, and it's got its roots in West African religions, but it's a mixed religion, so it's a little bit of both. And so under French rule, slaves were forced to convert to Catholicism. They had to be Catholic. And this was a demand of their French masters. But Vodou would continue, but over time it becomes mixed together. And it's mixed in and it continues in these secret ceremonies behind closed doors so the master wouldn't see, that they're keeping some parts of West African religion alive, even though they started to mix together with some of the new Catholic ideas they're getting. And so some of the big things you see in Vodou is that there is one kind of overall big god, this Bon Dieu, which is a creator of the universe. And however, you can direct prayers to lesser gods, to smaller gods. So you still pray to that one big god, but if you have a specific need, a specific want, you can pray to the god of whatever you need, love, or revenge, anything like that. And so these lesser gods would be Iwa, who serve the big god, the Bon Dieu. And this is similar in some ways to the saints for Catholics, in that you still have got one god, but if you have a specific need, you can pray to a specific saint. So if you are traveling, you would pray to Saint Christopher, for example, but it doesn't count God out of it. Other big ideas of Vodou. There's no single book, and that largely this was about storytelling passed on generation to generation. So this is not like a single book thing. A lot of prayer is through singing, dancing, drumming, and food offerings. So again, connect back to West African religions. Lots of crossover here. The priests, or Ugon, and you've got priestesses, the Monbo, and they administer medicines and they ask for help from these smaller Iwa gods to use magic to defend or attack. This allows slaves to connect back to Africa and build community with control over their own lives. So it's a very early way to resist. They can maintain those old ties back to Africa. They can maintain ties within their new communities in Haiti, and they can resist master in their own way. And it's an interesting religion. Has nothing to do with voodoo dolls or the devil or anything like that. Yeah, just don't get all your history from movies. Alright, so back to what's the edge of the revolution. By 1791, we have 32,000 whites, 28,000 affranchis, and 500,000 slaves. So the whites are very, very much outnumbered. And the white population, the white planters create a society that's very structured and very repressive. And so in order to stay in power, you need to maintain control. And so they set up this whole system to make sure that the slaves do not rise up. And we'll take a look at how the system holds them back. For 200 years, they're held back until eventually the system does fall apart and they rise up. So here's an example of the sugar plantation being planted. Okay, putting the sugar cane in. And then you got a little windmill here to later on crush the sugar. And so break down the numbers. So demographics of Saint-Domingue. As far as free whites, so the total population at the time of the revolution is 560,000. That's the total population on the island. As far as the whites, that's only 32,000, which is 6% of the population. They're growing only by 1.135% per year, and it takes 52 years for the white population to double. Compared to the affranchis are 28,000, they're 5% of the population, and they're growing at a 4.5% rate. They double every 16 years, compared to the black population. And it's looking a lot different here. And for slaves, they're 500,000, so that's 89% of the island are slaves. They're growing at 6% per year, and every 12 years, that population would double. And further demographics, as far as the racial makeup, so breaking it down, and that people that identified as white and were seen as white, 90% were pure white, but 10% were mulatto, meaning they were mixed, but they were passing, that they looked white enough that they could kind of have their documents in order as white. As far as affranchis, again, you get this mix, where people of color would be racially made up, white, black, but mostly it's mixed. And so you see this idea of race, it's shifting. It's not so solid as just, hey, you're black, therefore you're this, or you're white, therefore you're that. It's more complicated. As far as slaves, no white slaves. 94% black, but there were mulatto slaves. This 1% is likely what's left of the Taino population, so a few native slaves. As far as the gender ratio, the sex ratio, for free whites, it was 80% men, 20% women. So it's mostly poor white guys moving over to become overseers. As far as the affranchis, it's pretty close, 45% men, 55% women. Slaves, more men than women, but a lot closer in the ratio. And so not too many women, not too many white women in this case. As far as origins, where people came from, for the free whites, 75% were immigrants from France, 25% were born there. For free people of color, 95% were born there, only very few immigrants, it's very rare. Whereas slaves, most were immigrants, 33% native. And so with these raw numbers, how could they keep control? And they do that through the Code Noir, the Black Codes. And so Louis XIV creates rules for slaves. This is Louis XIV, Sun King, Versailles and all that. Creates some pretty nasty rules, very harsh punishments for disobedient slaves. And we'll look at these punishments and to kind of understand all the little things and the horrible punishments for misbehaving in the eyes of these the white masters there. But they also did some good things, and so it sets limitations on the slaves, but it also sets limitations on masters. So it sets standards for minimum food. The master has to feed enough. Maximum hours. They can't work more than a certain amount of hours. And there's also how harsh they can be punished. However, most of these rules for masters were ignored by the government. And violence is used to control through fear. And so anytime there's a whipping, it's going to be a public whipping to kind of send a message to everybody saying, this is what happens. The rights of the affranchis are limited in that they're not going to give the full rights of the white population, but they're above the black population. So this affranchis is kind of in the middle, that they're better than slaves, but they are not going to be classified as better than white. They cannot sit with whites in public. They're limited to certain jobs. There's a night curfew. And then free blacks helping slaves escape could lose their freedom and be sold back into slavery. And so that fear especially will prevent the affranchis from helping the rebels. As far as ways to resist, and so other forms of resistance reduce the number of rebellions. So the slaves will kind of fight in other ways. And this includes infanticide, where they might kill their children to prevent that child from being raised in slavery. We get many cases of suicide, where they just don't want to be a slave anymore and they kill themselves. And we also get the occasional plot to kill their own masters. Most commonly through poison. Vodou also allows this self-expression, that they can be free in their own way with their religion. So Vodou at least allows them a little bit of that. And we also get a lot of runaways, in that they have these very steep mountains that with very harsh and thick terrain. And so a lot of them run away and become maroons. And maroons kind of the new term for the runaways. And so here the Haitian language mixes together with a mix of Spanish, French, Portuguese, and African languages, as all these different runaways from different parts of the island and parts of the world meet together, and they form this new Creole language in these maroon villages. And this is from the American Spanish word cimarron, feral animal, fugitive, or runaway, where we get these maroon communities. And later on, we also get cases where they might run away to cities to pose as free blacks, and eventually they become free in that way. And we do get early rebels. That's Francois Makandal. So we do get occasional rebellions. But in most cases, they do fall apart. And so poisoning of planters becomes really, really popular because the house servants are cooking the food. Makandal was a maroon leader that led a plot to poison all whites using house slaves. And so he was hiding up in the mountains, but eventually he started to convince house slaves to, all at the same time, poison their masters. And this starts, but it doesn't really go through. And so he is captured, tried, and executed in public. And after this, the limitations and the rules for slaves increases. And so we get more and more restrictions. The network of slave resistance begins as this story spreads and spreads. And so it's only a generation later do we get a rebellion after Makandal.